Hi everyone, hold on to your horses and tighten up your britches. Today I have yet another set of shocking stories that are sure to make your head spin. You might even learn the truth about something that makes it impossible for you to sleep tonight. So get yourself comfortable, grab your favorite drink, and cozy up with that subscribe button. Thanks. Now let's get into the stories. I'm a park ranger at Biscayne National Park and have been at the job for the better part of 2 decades now. I mostly worked late shift. I started the job when my kids were little. It was easier for the wife and me to juggle our schedules as parents. And, I won't lie, there's something peaceful about the park at night, a calm that settles over the land like a warm blanket. This particular night was like any other. It was around mid-July, a few years back during one of those heat waves where the day was sweltering, but the night with the breeze coming off the bay was bearable, even pleasant. Rounding up the last of my paperwork, I headed out for my usual patrol. People think of nature as something beautiful, and sure it is, with its awe-inspiring sunsets and towering trees, but don't forget that there's a raw, untamed side of it as well. There are mysteries cloaked in the darkness and secrets whispered through the rustling leaves. This realization didn't scare me. It fascinated me. Pulling on my jacket, I started up the engine of my old Ranger truck, the headlights cutting through the almost solid blackness of the night. The road was familiar, every turn, every bump. Habit guided me through the dense forest that framed the asphalt road. My usual patrol route involved checking the camping sites, the docks, and the picnic areas, ensuring everything was as it should be. But that night, something was different. As I approached the end of the picnic area, the truck's radio crackled into life, and a strange interference filled the cabin. You know, the kind you hear when you're trying to tune a radio station, but you just can't get a lock? Just white noise and static. Thinking it was a technical glitch, I smacked the side of the piece, but it continued its crackling. As the static filled the air, my eyes were drawn to the right where the picnic tables were, and that's when I noticed a figure in the distance, barely visible. It was awkwardly silent, despite the noise from my truck radio. The silence of the forest was eerie and almost deafening, like the night was holding its breath. Ignoring the continuous static from the radio, I decided to investigate and turned off the engine. The figure was standing near one of the picnic tables, but too far for me to make out the details. I grabbed a flashlight, and with a deep breath, I slowly climbed out of the safety of my vehicle. My boots crunched on the gravel beneath as I ventured into the night. The harsh beam of the hand held light slicing open the darkness. I had a job to do, and that's protecting this park and everyone and everything in it. So I swallowed my hesitation, reminding myself of the duty that came with my badge. My heart pounded in my chest as the flashlight illuminated the area, revealing the mysterious figure more clearly. I figured it was someone trespassing after hours. We got that sometimes, and you never know if you're going to run into one of the crazies or not. So, yeah, I was nervous, but I didn't expect what happened next. The first thing I noticed about the figure was the size. There was no way this was a person. It was massive, towering over me at a height I could only guess was well over 8 feet. The next thing I noticed was the smell, a putrid stench that filled the night air. It was a rancid smell, like old, wet leaves mixed with an animal scent I couldn't put a name to. Now, I've seen many things during my time as a park ranger, from alligators to black bears, but what I saw standing there was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. Its body was robust and powerful, covered in thick, dark brown hair that almost looked reddish in the beam of my flashlight. The face, I don't even know how to describe it. It was some sort of cross between man and ape. It had a heavy jaw, a prominent forehead, and deep-set, almost human eyes that seemed to glow ominously in the light. It had a flat nose with wide nostrils and a chiseled jawline that was covered in what looked like old scars. For a moment, we just stared at each other, me frozen in place. If Sasquatch was indeed real, I was looking right at it. There seemed to be intelligence behind his nearly human eyes that I found unnerving. Suddenly, it let out a bone-rattling yell so loud that it seemed to echo across the entire park. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. and I felt a shiver of fear ripple down my spine. The creature turned, its colossal frame moving with surprising grace, and disappeared into the darkness. Shaking, I hurried back to my truck, locking the door behind me. I frantically grabbed the radio, informing the authorities about what I had seen. The feeling of unease stayed with me, my pulse still racing as I drove away from the site with the image of that creature burned into my memory. As I patrolled the rest of the park, my mind raced, trying to come to terms with what had happened. I had heard stories of Bigfoot sightings before, but had always dismissed them as tall tales. But now, having seen something so incredible and terrifying with my own eyes, I wasn't so quick to dismiss them in the future. Ever since that night, my shifts have taken on a new perspective. I drive down that familiar road, my eyes peering out into the shadows, always wondering if the creature is watching for me as closely as I'm watching for it. The calm threat of the park hasn't changed. It's still peaceful, still beautiful, and still completely unpredictable. So, there you have it, my story of the time I had a face-to-face encounter with what I believed to be a Sasquatch. It was a night I will never forget, and one that continues to haunt me to this day. I still patrol the same park, drive the same roads, and experience the same peace I always have, but now with an added feeling of trepidation and wonder. I suppose this is what makes these late-night patrols worth it. I never know what I'll find in the shadows. A few years back, when I was working as a park ranger at Hanging Rock State Park in North Carolina, I had a weird and honestly pretty horrifying experience. It was an ordinary weekday, hardly anyone around, just me and the wilderness. I'd moved to North Carolina from Florida. I grew tired of the overwhelming touristy coastlines. The mountains here gave me a sense of freedom and tranquility that wasn't there in my home state. When I accepted the job as a park ranger, I wasn't naive. I knew there would be wildlife encounters, and I was ready for it. But I wasn't ready for this. That day started just like any other. It was a little cloudy, sure, not a perfect day, but just right for some solitude in the park. The first half of my shift passed without anything out of the ordinary. Just regular park duties. Maintaining the trails, checking campsites, making sure nothing was disrupting the peace of the park. While I was making these rounds, I found some strange scraping marks that marred the bark on a couple of tall trees lining one of the hiking trails. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was some bear trying to sharpen its claws or something. Still, it left me feeling a bit unsettled. Guess I knew deep down that it didn't look quite right for a bear. Later that day, I was on my way to check out the South Trail when I heard an unusual noise in the distance. Oddly enough, it sounded like something clicking. It wasn't the usual scratching or rustling sounds you'd expect in the woods. It was a sort of rhythmic, mechanical clatter, like two rocks being banged together. I realized suddenly that the woods were hushed, eerily quiet, in fact. How long had they been that way? I don't remember encountering this silence when I first arrived that day. That's when the nervousness kicked in. The park wasn't entirely devoid of sounds. It never was. But this silence, combined with the strange clicking sound, made me uneasy. I picked up my pace to get to the South Trail. The peculiar clicking sound continued intermittently. I couldn't escape the silence. It was almost suffocating me out there. Having worked around these parts for long, you get used to the regular sounds of nature, but that day everything was so unnaturally quiet, save for that odd clicking noise that kept growing louder. Despite the strangeness of the situation, I reminded myself of my purpose there, to preserve and protect the park and its wildlife. So, with renewed resolve and possibly a little stubbornness, I decided to investigate. As the clicking continued, along with it came that uncomfortable chill down my spine. And that's when it happened. Suddenly, from the corner of my eyes, I spotted a swift movement. Something was there on the trail with me, crouched low and moving fast. What struck me first was the paleness of it. It was almost luminous in the shadowy undergrowth, standing out stark against the rich greens and earth tones of the forest floor. It moved like nothing I've ever seen, seamless but erratic, swift but hushed. Imagine having to follow a leaf caught in a swift current of a windstorm. That's how fast it was. I could barely keep track of its form as it zigzagged in and out of my line of sight. Without thinking, I flashed my flashlight towards it, and that's when I got a glimpse of the creature. It was crouching close to the ground. Its body was human-like, but not quite. It seemed too slim and elongated, every bone accentuated against its pasty skin. And its speed, nothing human could move like that. I was sure of it. It was then the most uncanny thing happened. The creature turned to look in my direction, revealing large black eyes and an open mouth like a yawning abyss. The eyes were shockingly human, registering surprise, fear maybe, and then anger. Sight shook me to my core and overwhelmed me with an instinctual fear. To this moment, I barely comprehend how I even managed to react. Yet, adrenaline pumping, managing to overcome my initial terror, I did the only thing that came to my mind. I ran. I darted away from that trail, frantically taking paths I recognized, avoiding foliage, sharp turns, and rocky terrain. All the while, the woods remained hauntingly quiet except for the beating of my own heart, drumming relentlessly in my ears. To be honest, I don't remember much about the rest of that day. Fleeing from whatever that thing was, fear driving my existence in those moments, I hardly remember how I made it back to the ranger station. But I did somehow. With the unnatural speed of that thing, I imagine the only reason I escaped was that it chose not to chase me. I still don't know why. In the days that followed, I was plagued with unease. Every sound in the woods echoed the clicking noise. Every shadow took the form of that creature. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized that running away from the park was not the solution. Hanging Rock was my home, my sanctuary. I couldn't let fear take that away from me. Back on duty, I tread those trails with wariness, but also defiance. I was a park ranger. I was here to protect this park, its nature, and its tranquility. Whatever I saw that day, I hope I never encounter again. But if I do, this time, I'll be ready. That said, I'm still here, still patrolling the trails, still listening to the music of the forest. Yes, it's a tad bit more ominous now. Every unusual echo-raising hair at the back of my neck, every unexpected silence sending a shiver down my spine. But one encounter isn't going to shake me away from my purpose. I'm here to stay, but these days, I don't stray too far from my truck. I want to share an experience I had a while back. It must have been somewhere in the early spring of 2018. I remember because the trees were just starting to bloom. I work as a park ranger in Chatfield State Park in Colorado. The park was already bursting with beautiful colors that spring. Now let me tell you, being a park ranger isn't always as glamorous as people think it is. Yes, we get to spend our time in the middle of nature, surrounded by the wilderness and all its glory, but sometimes nature can be, well, surprising. You may not know this, but Chatfield State Park is quite expansive. It spans over more than 1,500 acres of land, so my daily routine typically involves driving around the park, checking on things, making sure no one's causing trouble or in trouble. In a place that size, there's always something that needs attention. Back then, I was still fairly new on the job, but found solace in the nitty-gritty tasks that others found mundane. Checking fences, inspecting the trails, reporting back on the state of the wildlife, all of these were duties I treasured, not only for keeping me busy, but also for anything varied from the city life I left behind. So there I was, the air still crisp with the remnants of winter, but the bright sun promising the arrival of spring. The sound of birds chirping and wind rustling through the leaves. It all created this serene symphony that always put me in a good mood. On this particular day, I was tasked with inspecting the hiking trails on the southern side of the park. The melting snow had caused some minor landslides, and our team wanted to ensure the trails were still safe for our visitors. As I was walking one of the trails, I remember feeling that the air had this unusual, damp scent, like a swamp. But there wasn't any swamp or bog in that part of the park. It was a dense forest area with pine trees standing tall, blocking out most of the sunlight. As the day started transitioning into evening, I heard the familiar hoot of an owl. Strange, because they're usually not active until later in the night. I shrugged it off as an anomaly and continued on the trail. As the light faded, I decided to finish up the last stretch of trail inspection using my flashlight. It was then that I noticed something odd. In a muddy patch, I saw footprints. Large ones, much larger than a human's. The indents weren't clear, but they looked to be three-toed, much like a bird's, but bulkier. I didn't know what to think. At that moment, I heard a rustling sound from the direction of the footprints. I turned my flashlight towards it. My heart was pounding in my chest. I was expecting to see a deer or maybe a bear. What I saw, though, it wasn't any animal I had ever encountered before. I could only catch a hazy glimpse. It was just a shadow moving against the dark backdrop of the forest. There was something distinctly off about it, though. Something not so animalistic and more human. It was definitely taller and bulkier than an average man, from what I could see. Whatever it was, it moved swiftly and silently, without disturbing the forest's nighttime peace. Its only sound was that eerie rustling noise. Before I could get a better look, it had disappeared beyond the range of my flashlight. The only remnants of its existence were those odd, massive footprints that seemed straight out of a dinosaur movie, and the unshakable feeling of discomfort lodged in the pit of my stomach. Though I have spent years working as a park ranger, I have never experienced anything so strange, so unnerving. I've seen all sorts of wildlife, even dangerous ones like bears and cougars, but this was entirely different. Whatever it was that night, it's a mystery that haunts me to this day. The encounter seemed to have lasted for an eternity, but it was over in a matter of moments. In those moments, however, my world had significantly altered. There was a chill in the air which I hadn't noticed before, or maybe it was the sudden rush of panic and apprehension that was making me shiver. I tried hard to recall whatever I could of the mysterious figure whose presence had turned my otherwise ordinary evening into a foreboding one. I mustered my courage, ventured towards the direction where I had seen the beast disappear, hoping to catch more than just the fleeting image I had had. I called out, half expecting a human response and perhaps also dreading it. No answer. The pin-drop silence of the night was only interrupted by the flapping wings of a disturbed bird fluttering away from the trees overhead. This had turned into something more than just a routine trail check. My instinct told me to get out of there. The creeping fear that had been a stone in my stomach had now spread like fire. I tried to spot anything out of the ordinary, anything that could provide some clue to the baffling events from earlier. But the vast wilderness of the park responded with stoic silence, keeping its secrets from the curious eyes of a lone park ranger. In the morning, after a restless night, I recounted my encounter to my seniors. Their skeptical faces made my heart sink. The footprints that managed to retain some shape despite the rain were intriguing, but beyond that, there was no tangible evidence. It all sounded absurd even to my ears. A figure that was human, yet not quite, in the middle of the park, leaving behind dinosaur-like prints. The conclusion was a simple, rational one. A bear maybe, or another large predator? This was met with nodding heads, the simple comfort of plausible answers restoring the balance of our shared reality. I was far from convinced. Something had moved in those woods, something that was not of the ordinary wilderness. Over the course of the next few weeks, I found myself returning to the site often, drawn to it by a morbid sense of fascination and terror. I knew deep down what I saw that night was real. One day, out of the blue, a seasoned hunter shared his own encounter with an unnaturally tall creature within the park's territory. He mentioned large black claws and piercing yellow eyes. A chill ran down my spine when I heard the description. It was eerily similar to what I had encountered, a reptilian-like humanoid with a chilling presence. I was not alone. I wasn't crazy. Something less understood and more dangerous than an average predator was lurking in the park. The park never felt the same since that day. With every rustle of a bush or a shadow moving in the corner of my eye, I am transported back to that eerie night. I remember it vividly. It was a hot summer day in Canyonlands National Park, smack dab in the middle of beautiful Utah. I've been a park ranger here for about 15 years. I've seen it all, or at least that's what I thought at the time. Every day out here is different, and that's why I love my job. Whether it's helping lost visitors tending to routine park maintenance or dealing with a pesky animal, there's never a dull moment. On this day, the red rocks were glowing in the afternoon sun. The dry heat snuck up on you real quick, but I didn't mind. There was something about the vast emptiness of the desert and the seemingly never-ending sky that I enjoyed, despite the sometimes intense weather we experienced. I was making my regular rounds, checking trails for safety hazards and answering a few quick questions from overwhelmed tourists. I've met people from all walks of life who come to explore and lose themselves in the wilderness. I mean, the solitude out here is breathtaking, but it sure comes with its share of risks and uncertainties. That afternoon, things took a strange turn when I got a call about some unusual activity out on the Chesler Park Trail. No other details were given. I responded expecting to find perhaps an overly adventurous tourist in a bind or an injured animal. I tried not to get ahead of myself. I would see what it was when I got there. People often let their imaginations run wild in these vast landscapes, but for me, it was just another day tackling the unexpected. As I got closer, I felt something strange. It was that same feeling you get when you're walking alone at night and you hear a suspicious sound and the hair on the back of your neck stands up. Yeah, that was it. I've faced bears, mountain lions, even stumbled upon a rattlesnake taking a nap on a trail once. But none of those encounters ever made me feel like this. As I approached the area, an odd smell drifted by. It was kind of like sulfur mixed with rotting garbage that had been left out in the sun for days. And that's putting it mildly. It was bad. I know what skunks smell like, and this definitely wasn't one. It was unlike anything I'd encountered before. The radio crackled, shaking me out of the daze the smell had brought upon me. Another park ranger confirmed that they'd gotten similar reports from different parts of the park. Apparently, it wasn't just a joke. An unease crept in as the setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape. There was a silence in the air. Something rare, even for the solitude of Canyonlands. I shrugged it off and continued my search, and yet I couldn't deny my growing sense of unease. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. Pushing past the nearby foliage, I found myself in a clearing surrounded by large, discolored patches where the vegetation had withered, as if burned. Navigating my way over the affected plants, the stench became more potent, if that were even possible. An eerie silence loomed overhead, making me feel like a trespasser in my own park. Suddenly, I heard a rustle from a clump of undergrowth nearby. Preparing myself for the worst, I inched closer to the disturbance when I saw them. There were 3, maybe 4 of them. Small, maybe 4.5 feet tall, their bodies were lean, almost skeletal. They were naked and their skin ashen, as if they were covered in a layer of dirt. Their heads were unproportionately larger than their bodies. Their faces filled with black oval eyes, but they didn't seem to have any other features. No nose, no mouth, just plain blank, except for the eyes. They were captivating, and horrifyingly so. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind screamed to run, yet my feet seemed embedded in the desert sand. Their eyes seemed to bore into mine, probing, interrogating, like they were searching for something. I could almost hear whispers in my head, distorted voices that seemed icy and distant. Telepathy? Maybe. Or maybe it was just my own fear talking. My chest tightened, overcome with absolute terror and shock. I was no longer at the top of the food chain, a toy in the playground of the greater unknown. Suddenly, one of them jolted its head with an incomprehensible speed towards the sky. A streak of blinding light shot past us, followed by a gust of wind so powerful it brought me down to my knees. When the dust cleared, they were gone. I was alone in the clearing. There was no evidence from my strange encounter, save for the tainted plants below me. I trudged back to the base in a daze, every rustle, every wind howl playing mind games. After the encounter, my nights filled with dreams of black-eyed beings? Were they trying to contact me that way? Or was my mind just trying to process what it had seen? I had touched a world beyond my comprehension, a living nightmare that no one else would believe. Days turned into weeks, then months. I found no other traces of the creatures, no other reports. The desert and its creatures moved on as if nothing happened. Just another day in their existence. I've seen some strange things as a park ranger, things that aren't supposed to exist. Most of it, I chalk up to the long hours of work here in New York and the tricks of changing light. But this one time at Letchworth State Park, well, something happened out there that haunts me to this day. It had been a usual summer shift. The job wasn't terribly difficult, but it required a lot of attention to detail and long hours in the field. I did everything. Most of my day was filled with routine patrols, monitoring wildlife in the area and maintaining the trail system. Letchworth is nicknamed the Grand Canyon of the East and is one of the most magnificent landscapes in the eastern U.S. But that day, its beauty was a little lost on me. The weather was pretty standard. Clear sky, not too hot. I chose this job a decade back, and I usually like the things I encounter. The thrill of sighting a rare animal or helping a visitor find their way. It's a satisfying job. That day, I started my patrol as usual, binoculars hanging off my neck, a small notebook and pen in my pocket for any observations, and a sense of responsibility heavy on my shoulders. I was keeping an eye out for any signs of struggle or unease in the wildlife. Animals are the best indicators of something being off in their habitat. I'd been circling the trails that ran through the dense woodland, occasionally pausing to chat with a hiker or two, directing them towards the safer routes and reminding them to keep the park clean. As the day passed into the late afternoon, I moved further into the less frequented parts of the park. I'd just cleared the chestnut lawn area and was entering a thickly wooded narrow trail leading towards the Great Bend, a rather isolated segment that was naturally cordoned off by the Genesee River to the west. The day was gradually sliding into evening, and the sunlight filtering down through the tree canopy was taking on that golden hue I've always thought of as the magic hour. Though the beauty was still breathtaking, an unsettling stillness sent involuntary shudders running down my spine. I blamed it on the isolation of the path and tried to shake off the unease creeping over me. But nature knows better. The wildlife was unusually quiet. The regular evening chorus of birds was missing entirely. It was as if every creature was holding its breath, waiting. That's when I heard an unfamiliar sound, if you can call it that. It was more like a sensation, the softest rustling in the grass, sort of like a whispering wind, only continuous and not quite right. Being in this job, you get used to recognizing different animal behaviors and the sounds they make. This didn't fit any of them, and that, I'll admit, was more than a bit unsettling. But leaving a potentially threatening situation unattended wasn't an option for any ranger worth their salt. So steeling myself, I advanced deeper along the trail, toward the source of the strange sound, completely unaware of what awaited me. As I went in deeper and deeper, I started noticing the little signs of disturbance. There were places in the grass that looked disturbed, and the dirt seemed to have been brushed against, as though a speedy creature had rushed past. I loved my job, but at this moment, I wished I was anywhere else. Casting my eyes around for any signs of wildlife, I noticed the air was as still as could be. The eerie silence was only punctured by that strange, continuous sound. I'd like to tell you that I was brave through it all, that I didn't feel fear, but that would be a lie. The knots in my stomach only tightened. It didn't help that my mind, spurred by the odd surroundings, began imagining the strangest possibilities. Suddenly, I caught sight of some sort of movement from the corner of my eye. My heart felt like it had leapt right out of my chest. Instinctively, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of whatever it was that moved. Man, nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to see. There it was, this creature scurrying across the ground on all fours. The sight of it hit me like a ton of bricks. It was eerie to look at, almost human, but bony and gaunt. Its bones stuck out beneath its grayish skin. The pale nakedness of its body was striking against the fading light of the evening, almost ghostly. The thing that really got me, however, was the large black eyes that stared back at me. It didn't have a nose that I could see, only a gaping mouth. No sooner had I registered all this, the creature bolted off at a lightning-fast speed. Its movements were almost a blur, agile like a wildcat, but uncanny in its human-like form. Completely petrified, I just stood still, my heart pounding in my ears, trying to comprehend what I'd just seen. I had no answers for myself, and let me tell you, I've never felt dread like that in my entire life. In less than a minute, my understanding of what could and couldn't exist was shattered. I don't know what it wanted or even where it went. It seemed to vanish into thin air, as if swallowed by the woods. Breathing heavily, I retraced my steps, backtracking to the station as swiftly as my shaky legs could carry me. While the immediate rush of the encounter gradually receded, it opened up a floodgate of conflicting emotions. Did it really happen? Was it a trick of my tired mind? But the vividness of the creature lined sharply against the backdrop of the fading evening is something I couldn't just shake off as imagination. It changed my perception of these woods I've loved for years. Even the seemingly harmless sounds of the night held an undertone of dread. Sharing this feels like absolution, a part of me still insisting on it being a case of mistaken identity. But then again, some nights, when I'm sitting alone, staring out into the darkness, I can still see those black eyes, and they're always staring back, watching me.